Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the SAICE Transport Division's 20 Minutes with a Transport Professional. So we've taken a bit of a break on the series, but we're back full blast. And who better to chat to than the current chairman of the SAICE Transport Division, Alan Robinson. So Alan is a traffic engineer at SANRAL, and today he'll be taking us back to basics. We're going to be chatting about modeling and forecasting and how getting this wrong can really have serious consequences on infrastructure. Additionally, we'll also be touching on, the importance of knowing who you're actually designing for and why you need to take that into consideration. So Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. And as a start, can you give us a bit of a background on, how you specialize in traffic engineering and what your career actually looked like over the years?
Aaron, thank you very much. Just going back over the years, I've had quite a long career. I think, like many civil engineers, we started out, we thought we were going to build big buildings and bridges as a structural engineer. But in those days, without computers, I got bored out of my head within 18 months. Moved into contracting, not quite what I was looking for. And with absolutely no other guidance, I fell into traffic engineering. Joined a firm that specialized at that stage in transport modeling. And we got very heavily involved in toll roads. Doing state toll roads, and then we were involved in all three of the concession bids that are currently running in South Africa. From there, it moved into looking at work abroad. So I've sort of worked in places like Greece, worked in the UK on toll roads in Serbia, other African countries, Ghana, Nigeria, more recently Uganda and Kenya, Mozambique, obviously part of TRAC. So that was sort of more the traffic forecasting, impacting and revenue forecasting side of things. From there, I obviously working for a consultant. I spent 5 years chasing a bimodal freight system, which, well, after 5 years, I thought I'd better get a proper job, so I joined the consultants again. And 4 years later, I got the opportunity to work for SANRAL. And at that stage, 6 years ago, jumped at the opportunity at that stage, and I've been here ever since. Basically looking after and trying to get the best for the user, the road user. They are our client, basically. So from reviewing designs, reviewing traffic forecasts on projects, we've been able to hopefully improve the way forecasting is done. It's really a moving target, but I think we're getting there. So that puts me where I am today.
That's great. So you've had quite the diversified experience, and I'm sure working in different countries has taught you a thing or two. So I think we're going to start right at the beginning. Can you please explain to us what traffic modeling and forecasting is?
Effectively, when we do a design of a road or a road network or even public transport facilities, we know what the current traffic conditions or people on buses, people walking through stations, we know what the current situation is. But when you're designing for 20 to 30 years from now. So yeah, if we know we've got, say, 2,000 vehicles on a road, and we design a road that can take 2,000 vehicles, next year it needs more capacity. So the question is, what do we need to design for? And that is where traffic forecasting comes in. And we have various tools for that. But these tools are generally quite specific for what you need them for. And unfortunately, one thing you've got to watch is that you're using the right tool for the right job. I'll give you an example. If you have a road in the middle of the Karoo, you don't need a model to be able to forecast the traffic. It's fairly straightforward. If you are doing a traffic impact assessment, effectively you look 5 years ahead, you add the development, you add a bit of latent development, and you're more looking at that stage of traffic operations. So you need things like certain software that looks at the simulation of the traffic intersections, whether they're roundabouts or traffic lights, etc., etc. So that's the correct tool for that. If you are looking at, say, for example, new highways, like the GFIP project, for example, that needs a strategic transport model that takes land use and future land use into account. Trip generation, I think you've heard it before from others, the 4-step modeling approach, with all the detractors and other methods. There's a whole host of things you can get involved in, but essentially to be able to do that and to do an economic assessment of alternative implementation routes, then you need more of a strategic model. And going into intersection design on a model that big just takes a huge amount of information, and it's really not necessary. And probably, and I've had experience and I've tried it once upon a time, it's really not advisable. So, you have to know the tools that you're playing with and the results you're looking for so you can use the right tools. You're not going to use a hammer to try and get a splinter out of your finger.
No, I hope not.
But effectively that's what I'm saying. You're not using tweezers to try and get a nail out of a piece of wood. There is horses for courses. But behind any of these models is the forecast. And that is what we have to get right. Doesn't matter what you're using. And unfortunately, in my experience, I've seen so often, A, the wrong tool being used, and B, the wrong inputs into the right tool. And the resulting design can be hugely different. And I've seen some quite startling outcomes, which designers will then blindly go and try and come up with infrastructure that can handle something that'll never materialize.
Right.
I give another example is once upon a time, and I'm not going to mention which high-speed train, but there was a model being developed, and it had to be a full-on multimodal transport model. Now, in reality, the high-speed train's target market was the car. So, develop your model around the target market that you're trying to attract, and it just becomes a whole lot more robust. But you have to know what the travel patterns are of your target market, as opposed to everything that'll never use it. So, these are the things, and I think what I try and get across to people is start at the beginning. Look at, there are, internationally, there's things called a 5 business case model. And you start at the beginning, and that is the strategic objectives of a project. Right. How does this project fit into the big picture? I know from work that we produce, unfortunately the objective is fairly generic. So the first thing to do is let's have a look at that and see how we fit it into a big picture, which is very seldom done, which is unfortunate because, to give another example, you design for what you need, not to improve what is already there.
Right, that makes sense.
So in other words, the number of times that even though we have all the guideline documents, the COTO documents, we'll get a design where a guy says, well, the road is this wide, we've got accesses all over the place, therefore it is a class 3 road. It's a national route. Right. We know what's there. It's what it needs to be, not what's there. So your design is focused on what it needs to be, as opposed to upgrading whatever's there at the moment. So that strategic objective just becomes incredibly important.
Right. So you've spoken a couple of things that kind of got me thinking. So you're first speaking about, using the right tool and knowing which tool to use. But then you're also speaking about what it needs to be and not what it currently is. So I think I've got two questions for you, and I'll leave them separate. So for our younger audiences, so for our students or even young graduates that are coming in and might find themselves in this sort of role, how do they know they're using the right tool? Is it by experience or?
Unfortunately, it's experience. Again, you put a youngster into a tool shed. You just want to do a pot plant, they'll come out with a shovel. So you just got to learn these things. But the objective of these tools is not. You don't have to learn the nitty-gritty of them to understand what they're for. So, I mean, look, it's taken me 30 years to find out which ones are the best ones to use, but it doesn't necessarily take that long. But you do the right tool. I mean, basically, it depends on the detail. I mean, if you're looking at a traffic impact assessment, the chances are you're going to have to update the signal settings. So don't use a strategic model that can't do intersection analysis. If you effectively, and I know people will argue against me, but I use, or I'm happily use, what they call a static simulation model. You also have dynamic simulation models, which now we're talking the micro simulations where we're actually modeling individual cars, people walking across the road, buses and trams, and they have individual interaction. Now, that is they're great for complex systems. And you've also got to know the limitations of for example, the static simulation. I don't have a lot of trust in weaving and merging, which I would prefer to do in microsimulation. So, depending on the job, you just got to understand the strengths of the various pieces of software, and don't fall into the trap that every piece of software can do everything. Even though the people who sell it will tell you it can. And again, the other thing you will find is the best piece of software is the one that is suitable for the project and the one that you know how to use. Right. That does play a big role in the choice, and which you're comfortable with. So, and it doesn't matter what software you're using. It's a computer software, piece of software. It requires data input and it requires a person. Do not just accept what comes out of it.
I think that's a very good and very wise words there.
Compare it to your strategic thinking in the beginning. And transport planning, transport modeling, I would say there's a 40% logic component. If it, it's like anything. If it looks too good to be true, it probably isn't true. And transport models are pretty much the same. I'll give you an example. Probably the first 10 years, or maybe not that long, the first 6 years of my career, was doing strategic models for a guy who, I think at that time, he wouldn't quite know how to turn a computer on.
Oops.
But he kept sending me back to tell me my model is wrong because the answers are rubbish. He had that ability to just look at something and that just from pure logic and what he knows in his head, I mean, he was brilliant at it. And generally you go and have a check of your model and you go, oh yes, here's a mistake, you fix it. And eventually you'll see your results actually working towards something that's more logical. Yeah, there are occasions where a result does defy logic and it's correct. So don't just, if it looks odd, just check it. It might be right, but I'd say 80% of the time or 85% of the time, if it's not logical, there's probably something wrong with it.
That's good to know. We've basically sort of started speaking about, you've got to know what it needs to be in the future. And I think it's going to come back now to what the importance is of actually understanding who you're designing for. And I think those two marry, in terms of how is this road performing and what does it actually need to do. And that's obviously understanding what the road users need to be. Can you discuss this a bit for us?
Yes, I think any project, like I said, we got to look at a project in perspective and look at where it is, who lives around it, who's going to use it, how does it link up to the rest of the network. At the end of the day, we're always talking about a balanced road network. So in other words, at the moment, there's far too much reliance on the roads that are there. And we get it all the time. We get a development request that wants access off a particular SANRAL road. And it's a massive SEZ type development. And it's got they even want an interchange or something on the SANRAL road, which is, okay, that's not a problem. The next guy comes and does another one next door. And they too want access off. There is no link or road linking the two directly. So if anybody wants to go from one to the other, they have to use the main road. That's not a balanced road network. Those accesses don't link onto provincial roads or some other. So you end up with this total reliance on the thing. Now, that's not good for anybody. People who want to use the road as what it's intended for, as the through movement, it's now they're getting congested with local traffic.
Right.
And we're actually planning, the planners or the designers come with proposals that will do that at the end of the day. And our client, which is the road user for long distance, is going to get penalized if we don't cater for local trips. So this is where the whole balanced network comes in. The other thing we find, and this is something SANRAL's working on, a number of years ago, SANRAL just had the national routes. And then we were handed a lot of your, let's say, class 2 routes, your provincial routes. Now these go through residential areas. And at the time, SANRAL had class 1 designs and standards. And initially everybody was trying to apply these, didn't matter where the road went through. So again, you have to start, even though that's what everything says, we have to start rethinking and read, who is the user? And at that stage, in these areas, the user are the local people who live there. So now we've developed cross sections with curbs and pavements and sidewalks and crossings, even though they might be a higher order road. So we're trying to balance the mobility with access and safety, as opposed to, and then you sort of, there's certain areas where, yes, you've got too much happening and you've got to bring the speed down to 80 or even 60 kilometers an hour. And the idea is we're trying to change the driving experience and the environment that you're driving on, so you realize you're not on a 120 km/h road. So by looking at the people you're designing for, which is now a combination of the people trying to drive through and the people who live there, you now start having to rethink your designs. And then when you bring down a road from it to, let's say, a 60 km/h, one thing you don't necessarily have to do is have the fact that it is let's say, a class 1 or class 2 mobility corridor. you don't need to regrade to 120 kilometers an hour in terms of vertical and sort of alignments.
Yep.
It is now a 60 or an 80k an hour, and those relevant standards apply. So again, you've got to have a look at who you're designing for to be able to formulate a reasonable design, and what the loading will be in 20 years' time. And unfortunately, you need that before you start coming up with concepts. Right. And I think that's something I still have an issue with, or something that's still, maybe my issue, but we get an assessment report with the answers, with concepts. I said, well, what traffic loading have you done? No, we're still going to do the traffic study. So I said, well, how did you come up with the concept if you don't even know what you're designing for?
Yeah. It does feel like they've skipped a step.
Many times, unfortunately.
So I think what's quite interesting about this chat as well is the chats that we've had with public transport planners and even other transport planners. Everybody always says you have to know who you're designing for. Our public transport planners always say, you know, if you've never traveled in public transport, how are you going to ever design it? And I think it's coming through more and more to actually understand the environment and the people and what you're trying to achieve, rather than, as you say, just simply throwing out concepts and, you know, trying to maybe fortify them later with some thinking. So it's very interesting that this has come through again.
The other thing I always, more on a traffic, maybe on a not transport strategic planning sort of basis, is if you're looking at a traffic problem, or in certain places a route through a town, we've got a situation at the moment, and there's a particular traffic issue. The first thing you've got to do is find the problem. Because if you see a queue on a freeway, the queue on the freeway is not the problem. It causes a problem, a different problem, but it is not the problem. You have to find out what is the problem. And often the problem is nowhere near where you're picking up the problem. We've had situations where there's a queue backing up on a freeway, and concept designs are incredible. I mean, they're really sorted out, but the actual problem is a traffic light down the road is backing up into the interchange. So what you have to do is change the settings. You don't need a grade separated interchange. So, right. And we've got, I mean, sometimes I think we've got one here on the N1 which we'd be looking at, and to be quite honest, we don't know what the answer is. We've got a good idea where the problem is, but how to fix it is we don't even know if we can. But when the problem was presented to us, it was because of a queue on one of the freeways. Right. Again, that's not the problem. So once you identify the actual problem, then you can start focusing on a reasonable solution. I think the other thing, only one other thing that I would like to do in terms of forecasting is to, I have this thing that, I mean, obviously you need data, but one thing you must always consider is the limitation of your data. There is no utopia for data. Yeah. We have, I mean, I've done quite a bit of work on using ANPR data. And everybody tells me, well, that's all great, but you don't know the origin or the destination of the trip. No, that's true. But if you use ANPR data to come up with something like a count over distance, one thing you need in terms of doing ODs is independent traffic information. So if you want traffic counts, it's got to be independent. Counts over distance through ANPR are independent counts. And so it is better. It's not the answer, but it is better. We hear a lot about floating car data. Okay, and again, it's sold as utopia, TomTom data or that type of thing. However, I've got a little old car and nobody knows where I go. So it is good data. There's no getting away from it. But there's something that I've asked about is called social bias, because only the fancy cars have these things. And we have no idea as what the poorer people in normal cars can do, are doing. But again, when you start combining stuff, you're right. The other thing with data is when we plan for design, or we sort of try and work out the loading for designs, there's two things. There's peak hour traffic and there's daily volumes. Now, currently on the Gauteng freeways, the peak hour volumes are pretty much peaked. So if you take year on year, bar COVID story, but if you take year on year, the growth during the peak has been constant, is zero, basically. Yet the daily volume grows.
Right.
So one must ask yourself, why is that? Can I apply the daily volumes growth rate on the peak hour? The answer is no.
Right.
Okay. Yet time after time after time, it's done that way. And if you are going to grow the urban freeways, what is the pinch point? What is the bottleneck? And generally, it's the approach roads. So once they're full, you cannot grow anything on the freeways because you just can't get there anymore. So if that is the case, why add another 2 lanes to the freeway that nobody can get to?
Yes.
Okay, so you've got to look at all those limitations when you're coming up with your forecasts.
Right. So, Alan, I think we've had a really good discussion. You've beautifully outlined forecasting and modeling and, the shortfalls within it if you don't, A, understand your data, B, know who or what you are trying to do, and C, actually just thinking, futuristically and logically and trying to understand what it is that this infrastructure must function as. So I think I just want to thank you for your time today. It's really been fantastic talking to you. And yeah, we definitely probably will have another chat discussing more things on forecasting and modeling.
Aaron, thank you very much. I appreciate it.